At precisely 8:42 a.m., Kendrick Robinson eased his vehicle into a space outside the Greenville, South Carolina Municipal Courthouse. The soft warmth of the morning sun stretched shadows across the lot as he released a slow breath. Irritated, he despised arriving late. As a federal prosecutor, his career was founded on routine, punctuality, and thorough preparation, but today had not gone according to plan. What should have been a straightforward appearance had become stressful. He was there to dispute a property tax correction error on the home his grandmother had left him. For some unknown reason, the city had increased the tax, and Kendrick had spent countless hours compiling proof of their mistake. The house wasn't just real estate, it was his childhood foundation, the place he'd learned discipline and morals under his grandmother's guidance. Clad in a dark blue suit and pressed white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the skilled legal professional he was, despite the hectic morning. A critical call about an active human trafficking investigation had delayed him. The defense had submitted a sudden motion, and Kendrick had to address it. He reviewed the motion, shared his assessment with the team, and dashed out, already behind schedule. As he climbed the courthouse steps, his phone vibrated. His assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office had messaged, "The Greenville judge was known for being harsh with tardy attorneys. Be careful." Kendrick slipped the phone into his briefcase, exhaling. He wasn't overly anxious, evidence and accuracy were his strengths, but the warning lingered in his thoughts. He dismissed the feeling as he stepped inside the courthouse, where cool air met him. Unlike the well-kept federal buildings Kendrick usually worked in, the municipal court was worn. Beige walls, scratched seating, and the smell of old documents and stale coffee filled the space. Despite its appearance, the place buzzed with life. People passed by, documents in hand, tension written across their faces, worrying over citations, civil matters, and minor claims. Checking his watch, 8:50 a.m., he realized he had only 10 minutes left, barely enough to locate the correct courtroom. Navigating the narrow corridor, he passed by others speaking quietly, and found room 204. The brass nameplate read Judge Charles Whitman. Kendrick adjusted his tie, and entered. Inside, the courtroom was already busy. Kendrick took a seat near the back and opened his folder to re-examine his documents. As he reviewed the paperwork, the judge entered. Tall, with silver hair and icy blue eyes, Judge Whitman exuded authority without uttering a word. His reputation for discipline was clear in the way he surveyed the room, missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood, Kendrick among them, his posture firm as the judge took the bench. Cases began moving quickly, Judge Whitman's tone brisk and impersonal. Kendrick watched as a man in a suit entered late and sat without notice. Soon after, a casually dressed woman also arrived, equally unacknowledged. Neither drew comment from the bench. Kendrick noticed but stayed focused. At 9:15, his name was called. Gathering his materials, Kendrick approached the podium with a collected demeanor, despite the earlier rush. The judge glanced up, his expression cooling. Kendrick sensed a subtle tension in the room, a shift that hadn't occurred with other cases. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said sharply, voice slicing through the quiet. "Do you believe your time holds more value than the court's?" Kendrick raised his hands slightly in a respectful gesture. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was dealing with an urgent federal issue." The judge interrupted. "Reasons don't erase the delay. This courtroom runs on structure and respect. If you can't manage that, perhaps you need to rethink your commitments." Dozens of eyes were on Kendrick, but he stayed composed, replying evenly. "Your Honor, I recognize the importance of being on time. With your permission, I'd like to present my case regarding the tax discrepancy." Whitman waved him off. "We'll get there. First, let's deal with your contempt. Arriving late threatens courtroom order." You're fined $750. The declaration echoed in the space, sharp and final. Kendrick's jaw stiffened slightly, but he kept his reaction measured. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Your Honor, Kendrick began calmly. May I explain? The gavel was raised. You may not. Consider this a lesson in courtroom respect. Kendrick stepped back, thoughts racing. This wasn't just about punctuality. It felt like something deeper was at work, something others in the room might have quietly recognized too. He glanced toward the other late arrivals. Neither had been chastised. The inequality was glaring. And Kendrick wasn't going to ignore it. As he returned to his seat, he opened his folder, but not to review tax records. He had something else on his mind now. He started taking notes, his pen gliding quickly over the page. While the judge moved on to the following case, his tone steady and controlled. Kendrick was certain of one thing: this wasn't shaping up to be a routine day. Sitting silently in the back row, his thoughts raced through a maze of analysis and internal reactions. The courtroom followed its usual rhythm, yet Kendrick couldn't overlook the obvious inconsistency he had just experienced. He replayed the moment Judge Whitman handed down the $750 fine, contrasting it with the judge's lack of response to others who were also late. The young woman who had entered earlier now sat up front, casually scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered. A man in a gray jacket was currently addressing the court, though Kendrick had clearly seen him arrive after proceedings began, yet neither had faced the same scrutiny. The judge's sharp criticism had been uniquely reserved for Kendrick. And to him, this didn't feel like a one-off incident. It was a pattern, one Kendrick had seen before and could identify as clearly as he could identify legal precedents in his files. His instincts as an attorney kicked in, analyzing each part of what had just happened. A penalty that high for arriving late to a city-level court hearing was excessive, bordering on retaliatory. Around him, people reacted with a mixture of surprise, unease, and intrigue. Kendrick could sense that many others had noticed the imbalance too, even if no one dared to speak up. Next case, Judge Whitman called, and Kendrick's name rang out once again. He rose, walking with calm intent back to the podium, the judge's cold stare landing on him as if issuing a silent challenge. Kendrick began to speak. Your Honor, I have with me complete documentation supporting that the recent property tax modification is inaccurate. This residence has belonged to my family for generations, and the new tax rate is inconsistent with prior assessments by the city. He laid the folder on the podium, opening it to display clearly organized exhibits and reference images. He pointed to one section. This document reflects the original valuation, which remained unchanged for 5 consecutive years. The updated assessment, however, shows a 30% hike without any formal notice or stated reason. The judge leaned back in his chair, his posture bored, his voice indifferent. I'll review it when time allows, Mr. Robinson. However, your late arrival is something this court takes seriously. Do you really feel your duties at the federal level give you the right to undermine this institution's procedures? Kendrick kept his tone respectful, face composed. Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. My delay was caused by developments in an active human trafficking investigation, something I believe we can all agree warrants immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed, but his voice held the same coolness. Your cause may be significant, but it doesn't excuse violating courtroom protocol. Rules exist to ensure order. What caught Kendrick off guard wasn't the content of the response. It was the dismissive subtext, the way it disregarded his explanation, as if his professional role, his credentials, even his courtesy meant nothing in this space. Kendrick inhaled slowly, letting the tension settle before responding. I absolutely understand the value of structure, Your Honor. However, I must ask, Are those rules being applied consistently across this courtroom? A subtle discomfort stirred through the room. The judge straightened, the color in his face rising. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson? I'm simply requesting clarification, Kendrick answered steadily. It's vital that we all be held to the same standard, not only for myself, but for every person here. The judge slammed the gavel against the bench. I will not permit disrespectful implications against this institution. Your penalty remains. Kendrick gave a slight nod, keeping his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. Returning to his seat, he was aware of the many eyes still on him. Some looked on with quiet respect, others with nervousness. Kendrick had faced power used unfairly before, but something about today felt more significant. There was a tension in the courtroom now, as if everyone was silently watching to see what he would do next. He discreetly retrieved his phone and typed quickly, "This matter wasn't closed, not even close." He made up his mind right then that he wouldn't let it go. The court session continued, but the mood had shifted. Kendrick had changed the energy in the room. Others felt it, too. An older black man sitting a few rows ahead subtly turned his head, giving Kendrick a brief look that spoke volumes. The court clerk, normally robotic in her typing, hesitated more than once, her discomfort increasingly evident. When the proceedings finally concluded, Kendrick stayed back as people filtered out, quietly watching their expressions, the subtle burden they carried after witnessing what had taken place. A young law student in the corner scribbled vigorously into a notebook, her eyes wide with admiration and quiet resolve. Kendrick finally stepped out of the room, briefcase in hand, but his mind was already outlining the next steps. This was no longer about a tax mistake, or even the fine. It had grown into something far more meaningful, something he couldn't turn away from. As he exited into the fresh outdoor air, he was already preparing for what came next. The tension still clung to Kendrick as he stepped outside. Fresh air did little to calm the storm quietly growing inside him. Around the courthouse, the routine hum of daily legal proceedings continued as usual, but inside Kendrick's mind, something far more serious was forming. He paused on the stone steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering above his assistant U.S. attorney's contact. "Not yet," he whispered under his breath, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Instead, he stepped to the side and flipped through his notes again. Everything he'd experienced and observed inside Judge Whitman's courtroom pointed to a disturbing truth. What happened wasn't a coincidence. It was systematic. And Kendrick's instincts, sharp from years of federal litigation, told him this wasn't something to walk away from. It had started with a property tax dispute, but what he now held in his hands was the early framework of a much more significant legal matter. Sitting inside his vehicle, he opened his briefcase and retrieved his Justice Department credentials. The gold-embossed federal seal caught the morning light pouring through the windshield, and in that moment, Kendrick knew this was his opening move. By the time he returned to the courtroom, most of the morning's docket had cleared. Only a few people lingered, shuffling papers or waiting for the last cases to be called. Judge Whitman sat behind the bench, appearing composed but visibly fatigued. Kendrick approached confidently, displaying his badge and official ID. The court clerk noticed first, her typing slowing as she looked up. Then Judge Whitman glanced his way, and his previous irritation returned instantly. "Mr. Robinson, this session has concluded. If you have additional matters, you'll need to schedule them," he said brusquely. Kendrick remained steady. "With due respect, Your Honor," he said, voice even and assured. "I believe now is the proper moment to make a formal introduction." Raising his badge slightly, Kendrick ensured that everyone still present could clearly see it. "My name is Kendrick Robinson, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've served in the Department of Justice for over 10 years, specializing in human trafficking, public corruption, and civil rights enforcement. The judge's hands froze over his paperwork, a sudden tension washing across his features as Kendrick's words resonated. Around the room, a quiet shift occurred. Those few still present watched closely, sensing the weight of the moment. I was delayed this morning, Kendrick continued, his voice calm but unyielding, because of an active federal case involving trafficking. While I understand the importance of local court protocol, I couldn't help but observe the inconsistency in how certain late arrivals were handled today. The judge's mouth drew into a tight line. Mr. Robinson, if you believe something improper occurred, you're welcome to submit a written complaint, he said. Kendrick nodded slightly, lifting his notebook. I've already begun doing exactly that, Your Honor. I've been recording both my treatment and the differential responses given to other individuals who were also tardy, particularly when viewed through the lens of race. He met the judge's eyes. As an officer of the court, it is my responsibility to report patterns of unequal treatment or discriminatory practices when I encounter them. The judge leaned back, visibly uneasy. Are you formally alleging misconduct against this court, Mr. Robinson? He asked stiffly. I'm stating facts, Kendrick replied without raising his tone. I've built my entire career on protecting the rule of law, and that law only holds weight when applied evenly. What I saw today calls that evenness into question. The room was still. The clerk's fingers hovered above her keys, uncertain whether to continue. The young law student tucked in the rear corner scribbled notes rapidly, eyes wide. The judge cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. This court treats all claims seriously. If you feel an error occurred, you are advised to pursue redress through proper legal channels. Kendrick gently placed his badge and ID on the podium. I plan to do just that, Your Honor. But I also believe moments like this provide an opportunity to examine how fairness is maintained, not just in theory, but in practice, every single day. Judge Whitman shifted in his chair, gripping its arms more tightly now. For decades, his courtroom had rarely been challenged, certainly not like this. For the first time, his confidence seemed to falter. You may leave, Mr. Robinson, he said, voice low and guarded. Kendrick picked up his credentials and turned to exit, pausing only briefly to leave one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll make sure this is followed through. As he stepped out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he was acutely aware of every pair of eyes still on him. The atmosphere had changed. The weight of what had occurred left no one untouched. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a reckoning, a challenge to something deeper. Outside in the clear air, Kendrick pulled out his phone and began composing a detailed email addressed to his office. He included every observation, each interaction, and every discrepancy he had witnessed. Once satisfied, he hit send, knowing this would be the beginning of something much larger. What Kendrick didn't expect was just how quickly it would gain traction. The very next morning, his phone buzzed. It was the U.S. Attorney's office. Julia Harper, his supervisor, a sharp, seasoned prosecutor known for her unflinching approach, was on the line, and her voice carried both urgency and curiosity. Kendrick, I read your report, she said. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Kendrick replied. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Julia exhaled sharply. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately, but thoroughly in the Meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The call ended, but Kendrick's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Kendrick reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of desperate treatment flooded in. Some whispered in confidence, others offered with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases within days. The Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are notes I've been taking," she confessed. "Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore." The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. "I've been here 15 years, Wilson said. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. The headlines followed soon after. "Bias in Greenville Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct." News outlets picked up the story, and Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came non-stop, but he chose to remain focused on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately he began to realize the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received a call from Julia. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie." Kendrick, black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. "It's systemic. What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're taking this to the state judicial board, and Kendrick, the media is not going to let this go. Be prepared." Kendrick nodded to himself, even as a wave of exhaustion hit him. This was bigger than he had imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The story of Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman had spread far beyond Greenville. By the end of the second week, national media outlets picked up the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled, Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand" dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags such as #EqualJusticeNow and #bias in the courts trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Kendrick remained focused, working with the Judicial Review Commission to consolidate evidence. The findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants often went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Even requests for leniency such as payment plans were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant. Minutes later, local activist groups joined the fray. Outside the Greenville courthouse, the sidewalks filled with demonstrators holding hand-painted signs bearing phrases like "Justice must be equal" and "End discrimination now." Rallies calling for transparency and reform grew larger by the day, demanding accountability from those in power. Though Kendrick largely avoided the spotlight, he recognized the growing weight of what was taking shape around him. Inside the courthouse, the tension escalated as longtime staffers who had worked under Judge Whitman began stepping forward, sharing personal accounts of questionable practices they had long kept quiet. Mrs. Thompson, the veteran clerk, emerged as a central witness. Her years of meticulously logged entries, combined with official court documents, wove a detailed narrative of racial bias embedded deep within the court's proceedings. "I never imagined anyone would take me seriously," she admitted during an interview with investigators, "but now that it's finally coming to light, I can't keep it to myself anymore." Even James Wilson, the bailiff who had once quietly maintained order in Whitman's courtroom, made a public statement. "I've witnessed unfair treatment for years," he said with calm conviction. "It's wrong, and long overdue for correction." Meanwhile, Judge Whitman's support began to unravel. At first, he publicly downplayed the allegations, calling them misunderstandings. But as the evidence continued to build, denial was no longer a viable strategy. He eventually issued a brief public comment, stating that he regretted any unintentional conduct that may have caused harm. Yet in the face of volumes of documented bias, his remarks felt insincere to many. Kendrick, while surrounded by media attention and public discourse, remained focused on his duties at the Department of Justice. His role as a federal prosecutor demanded that he continue his broader work, but the waves of emails, calls, and letters that reached his office were impossible to ignore. Many messages came from strangers, citizens from across the country who had endured similar injustices in their own communities. One letter, handwritten by a retired attorney from Alabama, stood out. "I witnessed the same kinds of disparities for decades," the letter read. "But I never had the courage to speak up. Thank you for standing where so many of us remained silent." The movement was no longer confined to one courthouse. Inspired by what happened in Greenville, reporters and advocacy groups began investigating municipal courts throughout South Carolina. Other judges found themselves under scrutiny as a statewide reckoning took shape. In response, the state's Judicial Oversight Committee launched a broader investigation, promising sweeping evaluations of courtroom procedures and systemic biases. By month's end, the Judicial Review Commission finalized a preliminary report. Its findings were alarming. The review concluded that Judge Whitman's behavior reflected not just personal bias, but a broader structural issue that required immediate correction. The report called for key reforms: mandatory bias training for all judges, independent monitoring bodies, and regular audits of judicial decisions to ensure equity. Facing increasing public pressure and the threat of disciplinary proceedings, Judge Whitman submitted his resignation. In a brief statement he said, "I believe stepping down is in the best interest of both this court and our community." Reactions were divided. Some took it as an admission of wrongdoing, while others saw it as a necessary step toward restoring integrity. For Kendrick, the resignation marked progress, not victory. It was a step in the right direction, but it was only the beginning. With reforms starting to take root, Kendrick found himself stepping into a new role. He received invitations to speak at universities, bar associations, and community forums, sharing his experience and encouraging a deeper dialogue about structural discrimination in the legal system. His story resonated, especially among aspiring attorneys from marginalized backgrounds. After one speech, a young black law student approached him, eyes shining with resolve. "You made me realize the law isn't just about procedure, it's about protecting people," she said. "You gave me something to fight for." Kendrick smiled, deeply moved. "The work's just starting," he replied. "But if each of us stays committed, we can make this system better for everyone." 3 months after that pivotal morning in court, the Greenville courthouse bore the marks of transformation. The once drab interior had been refreshed with bright paint and a welcoming entrance desk. Clear signage in multiple languages now guided visitors to services they hadn't previously known existed: payment assistance, legal aid, educational brochures. Near the entrance, a modest but powerful plaque had been installed. It read, "Equal justice is a right, not a privilege." Inside the courtroom itself, change was evident. Judge Whitman no longer sat behind the bench. His replacement, a younger jurist known for impartiality and compassion, had quietly stepped in, already earning a reputation for fair rulings. Most notably, the structure of the courthouse had changed. Bias training became mandatory for all court staff, with sessions led by experts in behavioral psychology and social justice, focusing on how implicit bias can unknowingly influence decisions. On this day, Kendrick stood quietly at the back of the renovated courtroom, waiting to address a group of local legal professionals. He had been invited to speak about the changes, the process, and the lessons learned. As he surveyed the room, once a symbol of injustice, now inching toward fairness, he felt a cautious but real hope take root. Transformation had taken root, though Kendrick understood the journey toward justice was far from finished. The reforms sparked by his actions spread well beyond Greenville. Motivated by his stand, municipalities throughout South Carolina, and eventually across the U.S., began examining their own judicial systems. State oversight boards initiated mandatory reviews of court rulings, with a focus on identifying and addressing racial and economic disparities. Watchdog panels made up of legal scholars, grassroots organizers, and formerly impacted individuals were formed to observe courtroom procedures and enforce accountability. Within Kendrick's office, the momentum of change was undeniable. The citation he'd received that morning months ago now sat framed on his wall, not as a badge of honor, but as a solemn reminder of why he'd taken a stand. Below it, a photo from a recent speaking engagement captured a group of law students who had launched a civil rights initiative inspired by his efforts. Their bright expressions conveyed optimism, and Kendrick felt a profound obligation to pave the way for future justice advocates. Throughout the local community, the ripple effects continued. James Wilson, the long-serving bailiff once stationed under Judge Whitman, now led court officer training seminars focused on bias awareness. In one of his sessions, he spoke to a group of new recruits. "Our role isn't just to maintain order," he said. "It's to make sure every person who walks through those doors is met with humanity. If something's wrong, speak up. Silence is part of the problem." Mrs. Thompson, the dedicated court clerk whose records had played a vital role in exposing the inequities, had been promoted to manage a new department committed to ethical court operations. She mentored incoming clerks, determined to ensure the courtroom never returned to old habits. Kendrick's reach expanded into the academic world as well. He began teaching a course at a local law school, centering on ethics and civil rights in the legal system. Many students, moved by his story, lingered after class seeking guidance on how they too could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him, notebook in hand, filled with policy suggestions. "What's the most important thing we can do to improve fairness?" she asked. Kendrick paused before replying. "Listen, really listen, to those who come through our courts and those too afraid to speak. Listening is where reform begins." Not all welcomed the changes. Certain judges and attorneys resisted the new measures, arguing they infringed on judicial autonomy. But the statistics made it clear. Within a year, racial disparities in fines and sentencing in Greenville's court had notably decreased. More payment plans were approved, and defendants reported feeling treated with greater respect. For Kendrick, the most meaningful validation came not from headlines but from personal encounters. One day, an elderly black man who'd been present in the courtroom during that turning point hearing approached him quietly. "I've walked into this courthouse for 40 years, the man said, eyes moist with emotion. "I've seen so much wrong. Never thought I'd see the day someone stood up and said, 'Enough. You gave us something we didn't think we'd feel again, hope.'" Another morning, Kendrick opened a letter at his desk. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who'd read about his stand and launched her own inquiry into judicial bias in her district. She concluded her letter with one simple, powerful sentence: "You reminded me why I chose this profession." Kendrick read the message twice before filing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment sink in. This fight was never about his name or legacy. It was about amplifying voices that had too long been dismissed. Now, they were being heard. Several months later, Kendrick returned to the courthouse where everything had started, not for litigation, but to speak at the dedication of a newly established Center for Judicial Integrity, created in part due to his efforts. As he stepped behind the podium, he scanned the audience. Judges, attorneys, clerks, and everyday citizens filled the seats. Their expressions were open, hopeful. "Justice isn't only about statutes," Kendrick began, his voice steady and clear. "It's about how we treat people. It's about equity, compassion, and respect. And it's about reminding every person who enters this building that their life and voice matter." Applause erupted across the chamber, but Kendrick wasn't listening for claps. He was watching faces. In them, he saw resolve. He saw promise. He saw a system slowly bending, at last, towards something fairer. And he understood, with full clarity, that while the journey was far from finished, they had finally taken the right step forward.